Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 9 about civil rights. It's Lesson 4 about limiting civil rights. In this lesson, you'll learn about the state action doctrine, you'll learn about the United States Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, and you'll learn about the doctrine of separate but equal. In previous lessons, we discussed the mechanisms that were put in the United States Constitution after the Civil War to try to place the freed African American slaves in an equal status with the white majority. Among the provisions that we talked about was the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Despite the 14th Amendment saying that the races should be treated equally, segregation, in other words, the dividing of people up based on race, was a method used in the southern states particularly to avoid the Equal Protection Clause's effects. One form that segregation took was when it was done by private individuals or private businesses. Private discrimination was much like state-sponsored segregation in that people were divided up based on race, but it was potentially legally very different. Notice the language of the 14th Amendment where the Equal Protection Clause is found. It says that no state shall deny any person the equal protection of the laws. When private discrimination was challenged in the courts and the cases went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court and were combined together in 1883 in what were called the civil rights cases, the United States Supreme Court declared that individual invasions of individual rights, in other words, individual people treating others differently, treating them unequally, was not a subject matter of the 14th Amendment. This became known as the state action doctrine. Basically the idea that the Equal Protection Clause's protections found in the 14th Amendment only apply to government actions, the actions of states. They do not apply to the actions of private individuals, which meant that a private business owner, such as a restaurant owner, could put up a sign in their window saying, "We serve white customers only," and there was nothing unconstitutional about that. The other form that segregation took, the other form of segregation in place at the time was public segregation. Now, what I mean by public is that it was sponsored by the government. When we talk about private discrimination, we're talking about segregation that's done by private individuals, like business owners, things like that. When we talk about public segregation, we're talking about segregation that's being done by the government. For example, here on this slide, we see signs that are invoking the power of government. We have a public swimming pool saying whites only. We have a waiting room for whites only ordered by the police department. We have a public park board declaring that a park is for white people only, that sort of thing. So we have the government declaring who or who cannot be in a particular place based upon their race. This is public segregation. This is directly the subject of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, that might make you immediately think that these things were unconstitutional. But there's a word in the 14th Amendment that we haven't carefully defined yet to this point, and that is equal. What does it mean for the law to treat people equally? Does it mean that it has to allow them, for example, to use the same swimming pool? Or not? That issue was originally decided by the United States Supreme Court in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson dealt with a law in the state of Louisiana that required railroad companies to have separate passenger cars for people of different races. So what happened was there was a group of people there who decided this law should be challenged. They doubted the constitutionality of it under the Equal Protection Clause. And so they arranged for a black man to get on a white train car and then be kicked off. And then the police action that was taken against him became the pretext for arguing the case in court and taking it eventually all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Now, as an interesting aside, even though it's not relevant to how the case ended up being decided, the man they got onto the train car, the black man they got onto the white train car, didn't appear black to anyone. He was a man who was only 1/8 black. So if we were to look at him, we would see a white man. But according to the laws at the time, somebody even with that little African blood was still considered to be of African descent. And they were segregated with the black people. So this is the person that they got on the train car. Now, why did they pick this person to get on the train car? So that there wouldn't be a fight when he tried to get on the car. He could get on in the first place to then be kicked off by a police officer. They needed to have the government involved in this. So the way they arranged for the police officer to kick him off is they actually tipped the police officer off that he would be getting on the car, even though he was officially a black man. So everything went according to plan. They got the case and they took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then used this case to decide what that word equal really means in the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The rule that they came up with became known as separate but equal. Now, the phrase doesn't actually appear in the majority opinion in the case, but it does show up here in the dissenting opinion. But this is the phrase that was taken from the case to summarize what the Supreme Court decided. What they decided was that law that merely separates or distinguishes in some way people of two races does not necessarily harm their equality. So you get this idea, known as separate but equal from the case, that basically means that even though we've divided people up, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are being treated unequally by the government. So a way to think about this is that if a state does require the races to be separate, it can do so as long as they are being treated the same in these separate locations. So, for example, a school system could be set up with white schools and black schools, and as long as the two schools are providing equivalent education, according to the decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, that is okay. Now, let's review what we learned in this lesson. What is the state action doctrine? Is it that bad actions require intent? Is it that the 14th Amendment only applies to the states? Is it that the 14th Amendment applies to the entire country? Or is it that states must defend minorities? The state action doctrine is that the 14th Amendment applies to the states. In other words, it doesn't apply to private individuals. What did Plessy versus Ferguson rule? Did it rule that segregation is constitutional, that the 14th Amendment is not applicable, that segregation is unequal, or that integration is required? Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that segregation is constitutional. The reason for this was that merely separating people doesn't necessarily mean you're treating them unequally. So what does separate but equal then mean, which was drawn from the Plessy case? Does it mean that segregation can be allowed, that segregation is unconstitutional, that black codes are still allowed, or that grandfather clauses are okay? Separate but equal means that segregation can be allowed, as long as the people who are separated into these different groups are being treated equally by the government. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 9. It'll be Lesson 5 about legal challenges to this system.